All right, we're just going to give everyone a few minutes to join. I don't know if I can see. Happy Valentine's to everyone joining. Please tell us who your furry Valentine is in the chat if you can. I mean, what better unconditional love than a senior dog, the most loyal ever. I have a grumpy one sleeping behind me. Hopefully he will remain that way. Definitely please tell us their name. I love always calling them out. I usually reference my love of my life dog's name was Fizzle. So I love to see the creative names especially. Oh, Luna sleeping in the fireplace, 10-ish years old Chihuahua. That's my grumpy one. My big one is in the other room, not grumpy, but the Chihuahua, you know. It's my furry Valentine. Hope people are rushing in to adopt them today. What better day? I'm telling you. I give love every day. I like to give, oh, it's not even right at 2 yet. Let's give them at least like 3 minutes because I joke, if I was even joining the webinar, I wouldn't be on time. So I like to give people a couple minutes. We took pictures of some dogs with roses and all of them were trying to eat them. So they're cute. So if y'all have something super creative, we always love to hear about that too. Cute pun. Jace, do you have dogs or cats?
One dog, one cat, one lizard.
Oh, a scaly Valentine.
Yeah, she was found in a tank on the sidewalk in my old jurisdiction prior to me coming to San Diego, and was like barely moving. And so we took her home to foster her, and my son fell in love with her. So she's ours now.
I love that.
Yeah.
My days in animal control, we did always have like, we once put a fish in a coffee pot from a eviction, and you do end up with a lot of other animals that you don't expect in like whatever thing you can put them in. What else do we have? Someone else that popped up.
I've seen some
more Chihuahuas. Those
Yeah.
are the old dogs. Earl Grey and Dragon. Dragon's a good name for a Chihuahua. All right, let me see. Let me give them 1 more minute. But thank y'all for throwing it in there. Definitely tell us your dog's ages. I keep hearing even these big dogs living to be 16. It makes me kind of jealous and mad that my dog, my 60-pound dog lived to be 13. And I'm like, I want 16. These ages are amazing lately.
Yeah. Better veterinary care if you can get into them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, my dogs, I feel like, live at the vet because I'm such a hypochondriac. I'm like, if you have a hangnail, we're going to the vet. Oh, youngins. These were youngins. All right. Well, I will get started, or else I'll just tell you about all my kids. I am Jackie McDonald, and I'm one of the board of directors here at Gray Muzzle. Most of you are familiar with us, but just a few housekeeping things before I give it over to our amazing host today. Grant applications are ready on February 20th, which is only 6 days away. So we know all of you are familiar with that process, but we also are doing an applicant webinar right after the process opens. It's actually on February 21st at 1 p.m. So if you need any kind of refresher on how the process works, or just really want to go through it again to make sure you can add to your grant, anything, please feel free to join. It's totally okay if you've been, joined that webinar before, or you've received the grant before. We love the more the merrier. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so if you have to hop off, I know being in shelters and rescues, something will come up. So if you have to hop off midway, you can certainly watch it later and share it with your colleagues. What else? Most important to me, thank you for all you're doing. We appreciate your confidence in us, but we appreciate everything you guys are doing and for tuning in and wanting to better, our process and caring about the different communities that we work on. So let me give you a little about Jace, but he's going to give you a level about his experience as well. He's the Vice President and Chief of Humane Law Enforcement across 13 cities in San Diego County, focuses on so much: investigations, emergency response, officer training, and he's on a bunch of diversity boards that I'll let him speak to. So I'll toss it to Jace, let him speak to the biases in animal welfare and see how we can do a lot better as we move forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jackie. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you may be. Like Jackie said, my name is Jace Huggins. I am the Chief of Humane Law Enforcement at San Diego Humane. And we're going to talk today about recognizing and understanding bias for animal welfare professionals. And when we talk about bias, I always like to, like, right from the beginning, start with some foundation of understanding of why bias is so important to discuss and how it can play a part in our lives when we don't even think about it. So if you have kids, you were a kid, hopefully all of you at some point, think back to some of the earliest things we learn in life. We learn how to match things with other things. We learn how to match shapes with the right shapes so that we can fit them in the little wooden block and be really happy and dump them back out again. And then as we get older, we start kind of identifying these different groups of people and connecting these groups of people in our lives. And that can carry on all the way up into our time at the office. And our brain does all of that work. Our brain makes all of those connections and learns how all of these things are put together in these little boxes. And you're going to discover through the course that that's actually an important feature of our brain and a necessary feature of our brain. But we need to understand that and how it does that and how it can do it in our personal brains so that we don't unintentionally group people in ways that are unfair, inappropriate, or group people in ways that maybe aren't following the best business practices for our rescues, our shelters, and our animal welfare organizations across the US. So as Jackie mentioned, my name is Jace Huggins. I am a NACA board member. I'm the California, Colorado, and Rhode Island state directors for NACA, the National Animal Control Association. I've been in animal care and welfare for 20 plus years. 12 of those have been in animal law enforcement. And prior to animal law enforcement, I worked in veterinary hospitals and I was a critical care technician at the UC Davis Small Animal ICU. And I love my medical knowledge moving into animal law enforcement. I think it's just a really great career path. So if any of you are RVTs or anything like that, and you're thinking about going into humane or animal control, feel free to shoot me an email. It was on the first slide there, and I'll make sure it goes up again. But I think it's a great pathway into animal law enforcement. So we're going to start real quick with a video. And it's going to kind of describe some of that stuff I was just talking about with the grouping and how our brains work. And then we're going to go into an exercise. And then we're also going to talk about lots of different types of biases. And then we'll have another little group activity at the end.
Our brain is a true miracle. Every day, it masters a myriad of tasks in the shortest of time and is quite challenged in the process. Neuroscience tells us that at any moment, approximately 11 million pieces of information are raining down on our brain. Only a fraction of about 40 pieces of information is processed, and of that, only a small part is processed consciously. To deal with this flood of information, our brain has to filter and simplify the information received, so it creates numerous patterns. Information that reaches our brain is constantly compared and labeled within milliseconds, long before we even consciously deal with it. Recognizing patterns is a key feature of our brain and allows it to work very efficiently. As a result, we're able to make vital decisions within just split seconds. If a new piece of information is, "A lion is approaching," we don't have to think for long and know immediately what to do. In the course of time, our brain created many such patterns that support us when thinking, just like templates to compare new pieces of information with old ones. Various factors influence the kinds of patterns. Our upbringing, for example. What did we learn early on about certain people? Or the media. How do the media report on certain topics? Our work What does our work environment look like, and what are we dealing with on a daily basis? And of course, the wide range of our own experiences. What personal experiences do we have, and how did we feel when we made them? A system of rapid exemplary association is what enables our thinking in the first place. What if, however, our brain falls back on the wrong comparisons? For example, when we meet someone for the first time, our brain immediately creates an image, the first impression. We then access existing information. That can be positive or negative experiences, images portrayed by the media, or pieces of information we just received recently. We hardly know anything about this person, but already we're labeling them. This way, it may happen that we may not invite a person with a different skin color to a job interview because we generally don't think they're competent enough. Or that yet another man receives the promotion because our brain learned that leadership skills are male. There are more male managers as exemplary patterns after all. This is the principle of unconscious biases, and it influences our thinking every day.
Okay. So going from that video, I want you to read these 4 news article headlines that I had to pull from the UK because it's one of the few places that don't put breeds in their headlines. And think about what your immediate reaction to was when reading these of what type of dog or dogs may have been involved, what breed. Oftentimes in our industry, and especially when I'm working with like animal control officers, people who are out in the field, people immediately lean towards either some type of bully breed, maybe King Corso, Dogos, some type of large bully type breed. None of these were bully breeds. It's the reason I pulled them. But that is a real quick instance of how unconscious bias and our prior experiences can lead our brain to make a snap reaction, a snap decision of what may or may not happen in a situation. So I'm going to have you do a little exercise real quick with me. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes if you feel safe doing so. If you're driving right now, do not close your eyes. But if you are in a safe place, you can sit, you can close your eyes. If you can't close your eyes, look at a blank wall, look at the floor, just try and clear your mind for me for a minute. And I want you to imagine that you are heading to a conference that you've been really excited about going to. And you are a little bit late to the airport, but you know, you're doing your fast walk. You get to the jetway and you're the last one on, but you're good. You made it to your plane and you walk onto the plane and the pilot is standing there. The pilot gives you this great big smile and says, "Thanks for flying with us. We're going to have a great flight." You head back to your seat. You do have a great flight. It's awesome. You get to your hotel room and you go downstairs to have dinner. And there's a couple next to you and they're celebrating their 20-year wedding anniversary. They're clearly madly in love, adorable, sweet. You go to your hotel room, you have a great night's sleep, and you head into the conference the next morning and you finally get to see a keynote speaker that you've been really excited about seeing ever since you booked the conference. So work through that for me. Okay, go ahead and open your eyes. And my question for all of you is, who imagined a female or non-white pilot? Who imagined a same-sex couple celebrating their wedding anniversary? And who imagined a differently abled keynote speaker? The general answer is very few. Some people might, and that's usually because those people have some type of lived experience or training that led them to a path where they had more exposure to female pilots, same-sex couples. And I will say that if you yourself are in a same-sex relationship, you're more likely to envision a relationship similar to yours versus a relationship different to yours. So and this happens because of all the things that we are exposed to day in and day out. Some people, when I talk to them after the class, they talk about how like they literally could see like a little sparkle on the tooth of the pilot, big white male pilot smiling at them as they get on the plane. And that's because that's what we have seen and been taught for years and years and years. That's who pilots are. I have 2 pilots in my family, both my uncles. And so societally, we have set that kind of expectation and mindset. And when we just allow our mind to wander, that's what our brain may first go to. Same thing for the couple celebrating the wedding and the keynote speaker. Generally, the keynote speaker is either somebody you already know, or it's somebody who's very similar to you. So what does this mean? The reality is that most of the shortcuts that our brain takes are absolutely necessary. When you are cooking and you are waiting for the grill to warm up so you can put some corn on there, let's say, do you touch the coals to make sure they are hot enough, or that to make sure they're hot? No, we walk by something, we see it's red, it's hot, it's fire, don't need to worry about it. There's no real conscious activity that's happening. All of that is the unconscious activity. And understanding those 2 levels of our brain is really important, because the conscious stuff is what we're actively thinking about. The conscious stuff is where we are working through it in our head. We are talking to ourselves in the head, however your process may work. The unconscious, we have no realization of. The unconscious, we have no control over and no realization of. So there are some times where people, feel like that unconscious connection is like a bad thing or a negative thing. And it really isn't, because you don't have control over it. It's not intentional. When our brain doesn't get those unconscious connections right, we're at risk of falling into traps. And once we can identify what those traps are and respond to them differently, is when we can start making true changes in how our brains work through and respond to those unconscious biases. So just a reminder, it's unconscious. It happens all the time. There's no intent behind it. It's a necessary thing. It helps us, like the example for the write-up for this class. Many people in their lives have left work, driven home, gotten to their driveway or parking spot or whatever, and had this realization of like, I don't really remember driving all the way here. And that's because you do something so much, your brain goes, I know how to do this. I know when to stop at a red light. I know what turns to make. And you are able to check out a little bit, and your unconscious core of a brain goes, yep, turn here, turn there, stop at that red light, turn there. Okay, park here. We are able to kind of disassociate a little bit from that conscious task, because our brain is able to take over. The other thing that's important to realize is that bias is able to be recognized and checked, and we're going to talk about a couple different ways to do that. It's not hateful, it's not spiteful, it's not intentional, it's very common, and it is not equal to racism, which is one of the biggest, I think, barriers that comes about with talking about this topic. I'm a post-certified principal policing training here in California. And when I went to that training class, the teachers were telling us how every time a police officer is sent to the class, they literally walk in, they sit down and say, okay, I'm ready to spend the next 2 days being told what a racist I am. And they have to like actively work to get the person out of that mindset in order to help this information sink in, because that's not what we're talking about at all. We are talking about how our brains work and how our brains categorize things, and how those categories could impede what we're trying to do day in and day out within animal welfare. So there's no audio to this, just go ahead and watch. When I first started learning about bias, I wanted to kind of understand for myself how these associations are made. So one day I went to Google and I asked Google, tell me what rich looks like. I just want to see images of what rich looks like. And I thought about if my kids were doing spelling homework, maybe they had to print up some pictures to identify their different spelling bee words. So I went to Google, what does rich look like? And this is what Google showed me. And then I went to Google and I said, okay, Google, show me what poor looks like. And this is what Google showed me. So there is an immediate visual difference that you can see just doing a Google search. So this is a media influence. This is something that we can get from social media that is going to put a little drop in our brain box about what poor people look like. So I love this quote: "A ship in the harbor is safe, but that's not what a ship is built for." And I hear that a lot when I teach this kind of concept of, we're doing pretty good. I don't think we really need to make a lot of changes. I don't think we have any biases in our organization. I'm not a biased person. And the most important thing for me whenever anybody sits through these classes is just like, move your ship outside the harbor for a little bit. Just experience and open up yourself to the ideas that a couple of changes could increase your adoption rate, could decrease your surrender rate. Kind of breaking open your mind and saying, okay, let's look at this and let's see how this might be affecting me or our staff or our organization as a whole. You might really be able to make some significant changes to processes that make a better experience for guests, a better experience for animals, decreasing length of stay. I could go on and on about how being willing to experience and understand and feel these things and work through them can make a huge difference for the animals that we are all here to care for. So we're going to talk about cynicism real quick. Cynicism is not a typical part of bias training. However, again, as I started learning more about bias and equating it over to animal welfare, I felt like this is a really important piece of our puzzle of how we kind of fall into these cyclic patterns in animal welfare. So brief overview: cynicism is a belief that people are generally selfish, dishonest, can manifest itself as frustration, disillusionment. A cynic expects nothing but the worst in people. Cynicism is the antithesis of idealism, truth, and justice. That's a direct law enforcement correlation, but also, if we think about why we all got in this field, cynicism is the absolute opposite of that. So here are some examples that I have heard. You may or may not have said and or heard these, but these are all pretty much direct quotes that I've heard in my years of animal welfare work. Oh, so you adopted this pet at a free adoption event and now you can't afford vet care. Shocking. Right, you've called every vet in town and no one has any appointments available, not even the walk-in emergency clinic. How odd. Oh, you just got this skinny dog 2 days ago. Please tell me more. Oh, you want a dog who will protect you? Sorry, we don't adopt out guard dogs. She just found this 15-year-old dog with multiple tumors last night. So I want you to think real quick about whether or not you've maybe heard something like that or something similar. Or remember yourself saying it and or thinking it, because that's the other thing to remember. Even if you think it first and you don't actually say it, it still shows that your brain went to that drawer, if you will, when it started taking in the information from the scenario you were in. And so here is my kind of gut punch for the day. When I found this slide and information, I was kind of like, holy cow. So cynicism is a trauma coping mechanism. Having faced strong disappointments in life, we learn to disappoint ourselves now to avoid the pain of disappointment later. We buy a sense of safety through a sense of control, but at a high price, the possibility of wonder. Cynics fear what leads to hope, what we believe we don't deserve, which is kindness. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in 2 seconds. But here's another quick test. This picture has nothing to do with dogs. There's no dog in the picture. There's nothing to do. And I pulled this off of an animal welfare Facebook page last night while I was prepping for today. So this is a prime example of what we like to call our dark humor, our sarcasm, and how media, our lived experiences can force our brain into a cynical loop. So I touched on this 2 seconds ago. Why do you work in animal welfare? Why do you work at the rescue you work at, the shelter you work at? Why do you drive into work every day? And for some of you, the answer may be a paycheck, and that's totally fine. But if that's your answer, then I want you to go back to when you first started the job. Why did you take the job? Oftentimes, the answer is, I wanted to be a voice for the voiceless. I wanted to help the animals that no one else cared about. I wanted to be there for my community and help them be better pet parents. I wanted to make sure that less animals had to die in shelters unnecessarily. These are all really idealistic, hopeful dreams of goodness, right? And so George Carlin said that inside every cynical person, there is a disappointed idealist. And when I think about bias and I think about cynicism, I see this like correlation, because we become cynical to try and protect ourselves. And then when our cynical becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, it allows our brain to start truly believing that that's a real life truth versus a coincidence that happened. So the pattern, it becomes, you start in the career, you're working with people, you know, your first interactions, you're like, oh, these people are being honest with me. I believe this. Oh, they lied to me. That kind of stings. And then you have other interactions and it's like, are they going to lie to me like those other people? I just proved that they lied to me. I hate being lied to. And then you have another interaction and you start off with, I know they're going to lie to me. I don't need to prove that they're lying because everyone lies to me. And then you get to this last one where your interactions, like literally your brain is like, everyone lies. Why am I going to try? They're going to lie to me. They're going to lie to me. I don't believe them. I don't believe them. Everyone disappoints me. So why should I bother trying to trust anyone? And if you think about us as human beings, I mean, our social structure is built on some form of trust or respect. And when our brain follows that cynical pattern and allows us to develop these unconscious biases against groups of people, types of animals, types of situations even, we immediately walk in not having that general human trust and respect, thinking we're not going to get it, therefore we may not give it back. And then it creates that self-fulfilling prophecy. Any questions about that portion before we jump into the biases?
I had a couple of questions that you touched on. So you mentioned about increasing adoption rates or reducing surrender rates with kind of lessening our biases. Can you give like a minor example? I don't want to put you on the spot, but either of those. I mean, that's obviously the main focus on all of us. So how could we do that?
Yeah, no, for sure. So when we talk about the biases, you'll see kind of a couple of different opportunity type things. But so reducing the surrender rates, or reducing intake. I'm going to actually, I'll broaden it out to reducing intake. When these kind of cynical and bias laden processes start happening in our brain, if people come into us for help, like let's say they are thinking about surrendering their animal, and we have a preconceived notion about who they are, we may treat them a certain way. Maybe we think that they are unhoused and, you know, they're going to lie to you because that's what happens regularly when you're interacting with the unhoused community. And so your immediate reaction to that human being may change the entire course of the interaction. So if you go into it thinking you're going to be lied to, they feel that kind of mild hostility or in unwillingness to have a respectful interaction. They may have been coming in to say, like, I might have to give up my animal, but I need some help. And they don't feel like you are someone that is going to help them. That animal may turn into a stray animal I just found. So because of that interaction, what they're feeling from you, that they don't feel like they can have an honest conversation with you, they may change their whole course of action. Increasing adoptions in a lot of ways, like I think our preconceived notions and our biases of how people should take care of their animals can really get in the way of adoption processes. And I've seen it across the US. You know, I came from an open adoption, low barrier, to a mostly open, mostly low barrier facility. So it's kind of what I know the most in my life. But certain things like paperwork, if you have a box where somebody has to check off a gender and your only two options are male and female, and that person doesn't identify as either male or female, they are not going to feel included in your process. They may stop there. I know I'm actually, I will share. A lot of people wonder why this white dude's running around teaching about bias and DEI stuff. I myself am transgender, and it's how I originally started in this work. I was born female. And so I've done a lot of work within the LGBTQIA plus community. And when someone doesn't feel seen or they don't feel represented in your process, they are less likely to engage or want to enter to work with you within that process. So having just male or female as a checkbox can be a deterrent for somebody. Maybe you have paperwork that asks for someone's legal name, and their legal name is Jessica, which was my birth name, but they go by Jace. And you don't have an option for them to put somewhere the name that they preferred to be called by. They may grab your adoption paperwork, feel unincluded and not represented in that paperwork, and change their mind and leave and go somewhere else where they feel more comfortable. How your staff interact with people. I use that example in the cynicism about, oh, you want a dog to protect you. It is really easy for someone to write, I want a pet who will protect me. For our unconscious bias to go, you're going to put this dog outside in a backyard and never touch it. We don't adopt out guard dogs. You can leave the shelter, sir. When in reality, what they really wanted was just a dog that would bark if someone came to their door, but we let our brain kind of run with the story, which I've been in animal welfare a long time, so no one can convince me better. We are the best people at making up stories about what's going to happen before it happens. So when we let our brain run off with that story and we don't recognize like, oh, that's my unconscious brain going, I need to take a step back. Let's sit down and talk about what protect means to you. And then we can have that conversation with them. And they're like, oh yeah, I want a dog that'll bark if someone comes to the door. I'd like a bigger dog. So if someone does break in, they might help me a little bit, but our brain can tell a whole different story, and we could cut that string before we ever even get an opportunity to engage that potential adopter. Does that make sense?
Dude, these are such excellent examples one, it has such easy changes on an application to make people feel more inclusive, and the same about a guard dog. You're right. Most of us would think of that like guard, like almost like protecting a business Doberman type of dog, whereas I'm just a single female that most of my dogs just don't get off the couch, and it'd be great if they could park for a minute. So these are great examples. I had a couple others, but actually we'll wait till the end. But again, anyone else, participants, please throw these kind of questions where we can make these applicable skills, not just, big picture wishes. Because that's what I think we need the most, is how to use these learning tools to do better, and easy changes we could do to make people feel more included.
Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
Thank you.
For sure. So we're going to jump into a few different types. We're not going to go over all 9 of these just for time's sake, but we're going to hit on the main ones. First one we're going to talk about is affinity bias, which is known as similarity bias. Refers to the tendency to favor people who share similar interests, backgrounds, experiences. We tend to feel more comfortable around people who are like us. This is a evolutionary thing, and we're going to talk about that also when we talk about negativity bias. But simple things like if we went to a school, so my wife went to a school in Sacramento called St. Francis, and I can guarantee that if we are walking through a crowd of 2,000 strangers at Disneyland, let's say, and she sees someone with a St. Francis sweater on, like she's gonna be like, oh, I can go talk to that person. I'm more comfortable with that person. That person went to the same school as me. So that creates an affinity bias in a sea of 100 people, all of which might be wonderful conversationalists and great people to talk to at an event. Our affinity bias will automatically lead us to people who seem to share some type of interest, background, experiences. For me personally, when I'm not in work mode, I am an introvert. So it is most likely that I will wind my way towards a corner where someone else is sitting quietly in the hopes that we don't have to have extensive conversation. But affinity bias, wanting to find and connect more with people who are like us. So this is appearance bias. Appearance bias is a physical appearance bias phenomenon when a person is discriminated against on the basis of physical attributes possessed by him or her. This physical attribute can be body weight, height, color of skin, facial marks, birthmarks, tattoos. The physical appearance of age could be included in that. So all sorts of different appearances that could lead our brain unconsciously to make an assumption about someone. A really good example in this day and age, you know, I'm guilty. I'm highly tattooed. When I wear my Class A uniform somewhere, I look like the most buttoned up dude, right? I look official. I'm in my law enforcement gear. All of my tats are covered. But when somebody sees me walking out of the gym and all my tattoos, they're like, wow, that looks like a totally different human being. And I have been treated differently outside of that buttoned up, tattoos covered type of appearance that I give off. Stretched earlobes is something I hear a lot. People feel like that desire to have like the big earlobe stretches or the nasal stretches or the labret, that creates a mental connection for people unconsciously of like, that's someone on the fringe. That's someone who's other than me. I don't think that they and I have very much to talk about. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out and use information that confirms one's views and expectations. In other words, cherry picking information to validate certain points. And I like talking about confirmation bias because in our field, especially in animal law enforcement, but even in adoption processes, those places that maybe have more strict adoption processes, and you do a little bit of research before you adopt out an animal, it is very easy to fall into the confirmation bias trap if you have already have some type of preconceived notion about the person. So if you're doing an adoption follow-up or adoption pre-review and you have whatever criteria in front of you, they have to live in this type of location, whatever, which I 10 out of 10 don't recommend. Happy to chat with anybody offline about that later. But you have this application and you are looking for information. It is really easy to find just the information that validates your preconceived notion. And this happens all the time in law enforcement and in animal law enforcement. It's why we have such a built out system to try and prevent this type of stuff from happening. But in the criminal system, or in the judicial system, the courts and everything, it's called inculpatory and exculpatory. Inculpatory evidence is all the things that make someone guilty. Exculpatory evidence is things that would prove them to be not guilty. And it's very common that officers will overlook exculpatory evidence, go back to the O.J. Simpson trial, and pile in all of the inculpatory evidence that they found. And that's because they may see something that could be exculpatory, but because it does not fit their preconceived plan of what happened, their brain doesn't even identify it as something that's relevant. So it's not that they're like, ooh, that would find that this person would, there is no way this person was at that location. Instead, it's, I know they were at the location, so that I'm not even going to pay attention to what that is. Here's another little quote that I found, information. And I've got the ethical leadership link at the bottom there. One of the most dangerous drivers of cynicism is confirmation bias. So now we're going to link something that we talked about earlier. We tend to notice what confirms our existing beliefs and ignore anything that might challenge them. Confirmation bias locks cynics into a cage they cannot escape from. They find more and more evidence to confirm their view that others are fundamentally unkind and untrustworthy. And this is kind of the negativity cycle you can see some staff start going through when they feel like people lie to them, nothing good, the good things never happen when they're on. These people aren't good enough, or a return happens and they're like, I knew it. I knew we shouldn't have adopted that animal out. Those are moments where as leaders, we have to sit that person down and stop and work them back through it. Because if we allow them to keep that cycle going, it will only continue to go in that downward cynical spiral where their brain will be allowed to have these unconscious biases that will ultimately change and lead to more struggles for the employee and for the organization. Anchor bias occurs when we overly rely on the first piece of information we receive as an anchor to base our decision-making upon. This causes us to see things from a narrow perspective. I want a dog who will protect me. Boom, anchoring on to protect, you're done. We're not going to talk about this anymore. So other examples of anchor bias, there have been a gazillion studies done on pay. And if you've been around the block for a while, like I have, you may remember when job description or job applications used to ask you how much money you make right now, or how much money do you want to make? And nowadays, those questions are rarely on applications. And the reason is that the study showed that if you were applying for a job that paid $20 to $35 an hour, you were super qualified, hit every single mark, were the best candidate by and far. If you told that organization that you made $21 an hour right now, they would offer you 22, not what you're actually worth. Because to them, they're going to pay you more, so you'll probably take the job anyway. When we don't put that information on there, organizations and hiring managers are forced to look more at what are you worth as an employee and pay you typically much, much higher. Another example off of eBay, if any of you ever collected Ty Beanie Babies. So these 3 Ty Beanie Babies were available for sale when I was looking online. And this is an example of anchor bias. This person was told somewhere that their rare Ty Beanie Baby retired from 1996 was worth $5,000 or worth $8,000 or $10,000, whatever. And they got that information. And despite posting next to Beanie Babies that were available for far less, they stayed anchored to that number that somebody told them. Conformity bias. Conformity bias is similar to groupthink, which occurs when we change our opinions or behaviors to match that of a bigger group, even if it doesn't reflect our own opinions. And so conformity bias, we're going to watch another quick little video here, one of my favorites. I see this happen, and I have seen it happen a lot when you have an organization that has like a wide span of experience in its staff, and you've got these 1 or 2 staff members that maybe have been around a while or have had a lot of negative experiences, and they have a negativity to them. And then the new staff members feel like, oh, that's how we do this. Like, that's how we survive at animal welfare. This dark humor is normal. It's how I'm supposed to behave. And so their desire to fit into the group will lead them down a path of developing their own biases unconsciously by taking on what's being shared with them. So it's really important for us as leaders to work with our teams to sit down and talk about this stuff and help them recognize when they themselves are potentially have biases or are becoming very cynical. And to me, that's a really upfront and honest conversation. I try and give the same type of information I'm giving here and help them understand, because you can take control of that. You can create more moments of positivity around it. But when we go, that's just Jim. He's been here for 15 years. That's just Jim. We don't change the situation, and we allow for these types of biases to keep taking hold. So here's our quick video on conformity bias.
Gentlemen, just take a stroll. There it is.
Chase, I don't know if we're supposed to hear volume on this. It's not very loud.
Let me see.
Okay. Oh, I mean, we hear Robin Williams a little bit. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Did you hear him talking?
I just heard him say thank you, gentlemen. Maybe it's getting loud.
It's time. You will get there one day. Cameron, you can see him thinking, is this right? It might be right. It might be right. I know that it is. Maybe not. I don't know. Mr. Overstreet, driven by a deeper force. Yes. We know that. All right. I didn't bring them up here to ridicule them. I brought them up here to illustrate the point of conformity, the difficulty in maintaining your own beliefs in the face of others. For those of you, I see the look in your eyes like, I would have walked differently. Ask yourselves why you are clapping. We all have a great need for acceptance, but you must trust that your beliefs are unique, your own, even though others may think them odd or unpopular, even though the herd may go, that's bad. Robert Frost said, 2 roads diverged in the wood, and I I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I want you to find your own walk right now, your own way of striding, pacing, any direction, anything you want, whether it's proud, whether it's silly, anything. Gentlemen, courtyard is yours.
So I'll make sure to get a link to that you all can send out in case anybody couldn't hear it. Sorry about that. But that's a great little scene with Robin Williams, and it talks about our internal need to want to fit in and how it can lead us down the path of just conforming instead of being ourselves and taking our own pathways in life. And for me, you know, talking about conformity bias, it's really common, like when we are looking in animal welfare and we're trying to decide, like, what's our next move? Like this isn't working, this isn't working. What's our next move? It's really easy to just fall into what someone else is trying, and maybe we have a really crazy idea, but we're scared to break out of the box of what's being done at the other shelters, the other rescues, whatever that we're working with. So it's really important to not allow that concern to prevent us from trying to come up with the next newest, biggest thing. Status quo bias. This is often called the if it ain't broke, don't fix it bias. Describes our preference for the way things are and things to remain as the way they are, which can result in resistance to change. I see this a lot, like it works well enough, why mess with it? And if we don't keep working on our systems and changing our systems, we're not going to change the long history of potential challenges that have come up within animal welfare. You know, even if you just look at the diversity of animal welfare, CARE did a study, I don't know if it's in this one, but I'll send that along too, about the diversity of animal welfare professionals. And we are a very, very, very white industry, working primarily in non-white communities, neighborhoods. And so we're not very representative, and we have to be willing to break out and be like, no, we want to diversify our team so that our community feels represented when they walk into our facility, when they talk to our staff. And we want to make sure that we are putting forth similarities, because everybody wants to see themselves represented. You know, that is a fundamental thing that we don't necessarily always think about. But I will tell you personally, being part of the LGBTQI plus community, I have read job descriptions and watched, you know, buy-in videos for candidates from different government agencies and nonprofits. And when I watch those videos, if I don't feel like I'm represented in that information, I'm not interested in applying. I don't want to put myself somewhere where I'm going to stick out like a sore thumb or never be comfortable talking about who I am authentically. Because if our teams can't talk about who they are authentically and share their lives to an appropriate level, we're not going to be the best team out there. We're not going to be as good as we possibly could be at getting animals into new homes, at pulling animals out of shelters, all of those things, because our teams don't feel fit, like they fit in, like they're represented within our team, within our group. And that makes it harder. You know, I'll tell you, when I came to San Diego Humane, I was getting a tour of all the campuses, and I started in June, and I walked into one of our 5 campuses, and the entire facility was decorated for Pride. And it was mind blowing to me, because I came from a very inclusive company, but walking into that and seeing how supportive they were of their LGBTQIA plus employees was amazing. And it's not something that you see everywhere. And I can't help but think about that type of willingness to be outside of the box and be so supportive of a group of people can only make that organization better in the long run, because those staff feel seen, they feel supported. So going back, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That can go across a whole bunch of things. Your application process, your interview process, your dog-to-dog process, whatever it may be. If you aren't looking at it to see if it needs to be worked on, you probably should be, because you're probably just going along with status quo and letting it ride. And there are things you could be doing to fix it, to make it a little bit better. Authority bias refers to the tendency to believe in authority figures and I'll follow their instructions. I'll give a real quick example of this. We had an officer at my old facility who, great officer, had been an officer for years. He went to a case that was clearly a intentional animal cruelty felony case. He was getting all of his stuff together, getting his evidence, and a police officer walked up to him and said, "Hey, we're going to write him a misdemeanor ticket for 597A." And my officer just sat there and looked at me. He's like, "Okay." And so I talked to him about it later and I was like, "You knew it was a felony. Like, why did you let them write the ticket?" And he's like, "I don't know. He's a police officer. I figured he knew better." And I'm like, "You're the subject matter expert. We're the animal people, you know?" And it's just that thing that clicks. Someone in an authority position tells you something and you're like, okay. So that's authority bias. Well, recency bias. Recency bias occurs when we attribute greater importance to recent events over past events because they're easier to remember. And so, you know, media has a huge effect on this, all the different things that have happened, and then all of our interactions. If we have a bad interaction on Wednesday with a, let's say, a person who our mind thinks might be on under the influence of some type of substance. So on Wednesday, we're having an interaction, our brain's sending off the signals like, I think this person's under the influence. I don't think they know what they're talking about. And that person does something. Maybe they try and jump over the counter or they try and take a swing. They don't actually hurt you. They get kicked out of a facility. The next day, when somebody comes in, you're going to be far more on guard because you have that recency bias within your unconscious brain than a year later if someone walks in and you don't have that experience in the in-between period. Negativity bias. Negativity bias is our tendency not only to register negative stimuli more readily, but also to dwell on those events. Also known as positive-negative asymmetry. This negativity bias means that we feel the sting of a rebuke more powerfully than we feel the joy of a praise. This psychological phenomenon explains why bad first impressions can be so difficult to overcome and why past traumas can have such long lingering effects. In almost any interaction, we are more likely to notice negative things and later remember them more vividly. So think about, you know, evaluations at work. You go and you get an evaluation and your boss is like, "This is great. This is great. You've got fours and fives all across. Hey, I do want you to work on this. You know, I've noticed that you tend to use this terminology, which I don't think is professional as it could be. I'd prefer you say something like this." You can have an amazing review and you will walk out and you will call your best friend, spouse, platonic life partner, whatever, and you'll call and be like, "Can you believe what my boss just said?" No matter how much good stuff was there, you are going to pull out that one little negative thing and you're just going to chew on it because you're like, "I can't believe that negative thing came up." Interestingly enough, and one of my favorite parts of negativity bias is that it's thought to be an adaptive evolutionary function, and there have been studies that have been done on this. Thousands of years ago, our ancestors were exposed to immediate environmental threats that we no longer need to worry about. Predators, for example. And being more attentive to these negative stimuli played a useful role in survival. As humans, we tend to remember traumatic experiences better, recall insults better, react more strongly to negative stimuli, think about negative things more frequently than positive ones, respond more strongly to negative events than to equally positive ones. As an example, you have a great day at work, a coworker makes an offhand comment that you find irritating, then you find yourself stewing over their words for the rest of the day. So going back to that fire, hot, don't touch, you know, evolutionary wise, saber-toothed tiger, don't walk that way, go the other way. Our brains were pre-wired to make sure that we had that negative understanding so that we could avoid danger. Nowadays, it's not as big of a deal. However, it still does come up as human beings. If you have had a negative interaction with somebody, you know, let's say a Latino male, you may be walking down the street and you see someone dressed very similar to what that person looked like, and you may walk across the street without even thinking about it. That's your brain's negativity bias going, "Oh, that might be a danger situation. I'm going to go over here." As human beings, we can avoid entire foods based on negativity bias. You know, I got sick off of ribs when I was 8 years old. I don't think I ate ribs for 20 years. My brain was like, no, ribs bad. Do not eat the ribs. So this can play a part in a lot of different parts of our lives. So we're gonna do a little exercise here called Name That Bias. I think I can put the chat over here. So first one, you all can put this in the chat section. Oh, is the chat only for host and panelists, or can everyone go into the chat?
Everyone can use it.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so Sam's working at the adoptions counter. Mr. Green Shirt and Mr. Gray Shirt walk in at practically the same time. They are not together, but they are both there to hopefully adopt the last Shih Tzu puppy in a litter. As Sam looked up from her computer to greet them, her brain registered that Mr. Gray Shirt was someone that she had seen at her local gym. She greeted him first and handled his adoption of the last puppy. What type of bias might have played a part there?
Are you gonna give us multiple choice?
That's one of the ones that we just talked about. So what we talked about: affinity, recency, conformity. What other ones did we talk about now? It's one of those four.
I'm gonna hold back and let the,
Yep. Megan gets it. Affinity bias. So it's the like me bias. Oh, I know this person. This person is like me. They go to the gym, they exercise, and we go to the same gym. So affinity bias. And I mean, if you think about it, if you're running a brick and mortar facility, these type of situations, they can get hot. You can end up in the news over who got to adopt the last Shih Tzu puppy. If somebody feels like they were slighted, because this guy was a foot behind me, but your staff member said hi to him first, and he got the puppy that I wanted to adopt. Okay, on Monday, Officer James was bitten by a shepherd. It was not a major bite, but it was a highly stressful situation that could have been worse if not for the officer's quick thinking. Officer James returned to work on Wednesday morning in response to a bite call. The call notes were as follows: large German Shepherd dog loose at 123 Main Street, bit RP on hand. ACO James responded, the RP, that's the reporting party, was not home, but gave a statement over the phone that the German Shepherd was loose, jumped up, knocked him down, bit him on the knee. The dog owner stated that the dog was loose, but never bit the RP. She states her dog did a puppy bow, and the reporting party started screaming and swung a golf club at her dog. He missed and fell onto his knee. ACO James quarantines the dog, writes the owner a ticket for loose and a ticket for allowing her dog to bite. The ticket is appealed, and when asked for evidence of the bite at the appeal hearing, this is the evidence that the reporting party provided. So what type of bias trap could that officer have fallen into? Got bit by a shepherd on Monday, went to a call about a biting shepherd on Wednesday. Excellent. Yep. Recency bias. So something happened recently and it has been brought to the forefront of the unconscious brain, allowing this officer to keep that high alert going. You could probably also argue some type of like negativity bias related to shepherds, but that would be a more sustained bias versus this just being 2 days apart. It's far more likely to be a recency bias. Melissa is assigned a news story about dog bites on the rise in the city of Uh-oh. Personally, she believes that the local shelter is adopting out dangerous animals. To gather information for her story, she submits a records request for all animal bites in the city, all enforcement related to bites, all dangerous dog cases, and all animals returned to the shelter for biting someone in the last 5 years. She interviews 2 residents in the city who were also victims of dog bites for her story. And here is her headline. 14 dogs returned to city of animal shelter after biting in new home. What type of bias might this be? Could be negativity bias, but there's another one. The one where we seek out the information that we want to prove our confirmation bias. Yep. So if you look at that public records request, all she's asking for is information about bites. So 14 dogs returned to City of Uh-oh Animal Shelter after biting a new home means absolutely nothing if you don't know how many animals were adopted out, right? If they adopted out 5,000 dogs and 14 got returned for biting, probably not that big of a deal. But because she only cherry picked, thank you, Emily, the information that she wanted to prove her point, it's not an unbiased story. Kelly is hired at ABC Animal Shelter after previously working at XYZ Animal Shelter. Kelly brings up that the software XYZ Shelter uses could do the same job as what ABC is using 4 programs to do. Staff and management at ABC thinks it sounds cool and could be a great time saver, but ultimately they just never make the switch to a new software program. What kind of bias could be playing a part here? There's a fun little picture that came with it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Don't fix it. So status quo bias. So that is our tendency to want to stick with what's comfortable instead of wanting to explore the great wild world out there of things that could go on. So here's a quick, here's another one. So Mr. Wright goes to Mr. Jones's house for a welfare check. The dog is injured and Mr. Jones is trying to get funds to get the dog to a vet. Officer Wright gives him a pre-seizure notice. That's a legal document here in California saying you're mandated to get vet care. Mr. Jones then gives the dog to a neighbor, Mrs. Smith. Officer Wright returns and confirms that the change in ownership happened and discusses the vet care needs. Mrs. Smith assures Officer Wright that she will get the dog into a vet. Officer Wright closes out the call with no further paperwork. So this is a real life scenario. It happened with one of my officers. And what do you think, what type of bias may have played a part when the officer was talking to Mr. Jones versus Mrs. Smith? Excellent. Thank you, Rebecca. Appearance bias. So the officer talked to Mr. Jones. The officer's brain went, I've dealt with people like this before. They never do what I tell them to do. He's just trying to shine me on to get me off of his doorstep. Whatever stories, whatever the unconscious brain is kind of clacking away without us realizing it. And that led him down the path of doing this great big legal process. Whereas as soon as the dog was rehomed to Mrs. Smith, that bias didn't appear in his interaction with her. And so he handled it different. These two people should have been handled exactly the same. But this officer's unconscious bias reared its head and ended up having him treat them differently. And I will tell you, that officer is a great officer, an amazing human being, caring, generous. This is an unconscious thing. This is not a, I'm going to give this, possible gang member, a huge slap on the wrist. It wasn't that at all. It was an unconscious bias based on the way the guy looked. So here are a couple of informational things that can be researched on and looked at, listened to. Breaking the Biases is a podcast. If you like to listen to podcasts, if you're super into journals and medical type stuff, there's some journaling about breaking biases. And then Project Implicit, I will tell you, I tell everybody, go to Project Implicit and try it out. So at the beginning of the pandemic, a group called CARE asked a large swath of animal welfare professions across the US to do a few tests on Project Implicit. And I went into it and I was like, I'm not biased. I'll take the test. I've got nothing to hide or worry about. And I took the test, and one of them was related to race. One of them was related to gender, and one of them was related to socioeconomic status. And when I got my results back, it said that I had a very strong bias towards socioeconomic status. And I was like, no, I don't. Like, I work out in the unhoused communities within Sacramento all the time. I give people food. I help them get vet care. Like, this test is wrong. And so I went home that day and I was chatting with my wife and I was like, yeah, I took these tests and, the test said, that I had a strong bias towards socioeconomic status. And my wife did this, and I kind of stopped and I was like, what's, like, don't you agree? And she was like, well, and I was like, uh-oh. And so she shared and she was like, we started dating right when you went into animal control. And she was like, when we first started dating, you would order extra food at a restaurant and give it to someone who is homeless sitting out in front of the restaurant. You would give money, you would go in and buy food places, like you didn't even think about it. And she's like, nowadays you won't even make eye contact. She's like, if we're driving down the road and there's someone on the side of the road trying to get money, she's like, you literally will not even look at them. And then you drive away. And I was like, oh, because consciously in my day-to-day job, I was taking action to do the right thing, but unconsciously, the negative experiences that I had had, which were many, I mean, I can say as an animal control officer, working in a area that has a large unhoused community can be very difficult. It was creating an unconscious bias within my brain related to socioeconomic status. Once I was aware of that, I was able to then put little safety nets in place for myself that helped me. So I'll give you a couple of examples. As the chief, I do admin reviews for all of our dangerous dog declarations. If we are dealing with a declaration that has a owner who is unhoused, I actually will bring in a second person to create a safety net to make sure that my bias that I know can rear its head unconsciously isn't playing a part. While I was in Sacramento, I also took on the role of running the Homeless Outreach and Assistance Program, or HOPE program, because I wanted to create additional exposure, because I wanted to give my brain the opportunity to have positive interactions also to try and break down that unconscious bias around socioeconomic status. So there are things you can do. You have to recognize it first. So using the Project Implicit tests can be huge in helping you understand, like, hey, there's this thing, it doesn't make me a bad human being, but now I can work on it. So my big takeaway is always work from a place of wonder, curiosity, engagement, and connection. If you focus on those things when you're working on yourself, with your staff, with your significant other, all of them, if you come at things from a place of wonder and curiosity, I made a really not normal decision that I would normally do. I wonder why that is, instead of, I can't believe I just did that. So looking at things from wonder and curiosity, trying to create engagement and connection with your team, with the community, you're going to be able to break down some of those biases. Bias is not the enemy. And with content like this, it's really easy to walk away from the class and be like, this is great. I'm going to do this. So it starts as an intention. You need to put it into action. You need to practice it regularly. It'll then become consistent. Then it's a habit, and then it becomes part of simply who you are. And it's a really, it's 6 little things, but you have to work all the way through it. So force yourself, get uncomfortable, push yourself outside the box. When we become uncomfortable, when we stay in our comfort zone, nothing happens. Each day becomes just like the one before, and we do what we've only done. Therefore, we get what we've always gotten. So when we want to make changes, we want to do things different, we have to allow ourselves to get uncomfortable. There you go.
All right. Well, I have kind of a few questions. I know we're over, so if people have to leave, we are recording this so they can listen to it later. But Rebecca had sent in a 2-part question I want to start with.
Okay.
Can you talk about policies shelters and rescues can implement that reduces biases in services meant to help families keep their pets? As example, providing financial support for vet care. I mean, she goes on to say, and then how to convince a board to do that as well. But just to start with, keeping families with their pets.
Yeah, so that's a big one. I mean, that's really hard because it's not uncommon for us to believe that if you can't do XYZ, you're not a good pet owner. And this society, I think, goes back to early 2000s. We transitioned in animal welfare from rabies, and we're taking the animals, and if they don't get adopted in X amount of days, we euthanize them. We started this life-saving focus. And so when we kind of redirected our focus, we started this idea that we know what's best for animals. And when we believe that we are the only one who knows what's best for animals, it becomes very easy to judge people who don't do the things that we think are best for animals. I tell people all the time, if there was a law that said you had to love your animal, I'd be happy to enforce it. There isn't. So when you look at policies, I think the biggest thing with policies is you need to look at things from an equitable practice. And equality and equity are different. Equitability. So when you do things equally, you have 5 people show up and you give 5 people one bag of dog food. That is not an equitable practice, because the first person may have only needed 5 pounds because they just need to get through to what their next paycheck. The middle 2 people may not be able to buy any dog food at all. And this is the difference between them surrendering it. And you could probably give them 5 bags of dog food. And the last 2 people, you know, maybe they didn't need the food at all, but you gave them the 1 bag because that's your general policy. So allowing teams to work within individuals, and this is the question that I think is so important when you are working with community members, especially when they are thinking they need to surrender an animal, is what does me helping you look like? Because it's really easy for us to go in and be like, so we can do a spay neuter for you, and we can give you 5 pounds of dog food, and we can give you a runner line. But that's not what they actually needed. You know, maybe what they actually needed, and this is really important if you are working with government entities, maybe what they actually needed was a connection to the rental housing property so they could report their deadbeat landlord who is allowing them to live with rats, and they're spending all of their money on pest control because their landlord is a no answer, no respond to text type person. And the true help you can give them to care for their animal is to help connect them with a different resource, help connect them with WIC, help connect them with a whole multitude of things. So asking them, what is me helping you keep your pet look like right now? And it might be food, and that might be super easy. It might be vet care. Financial support for vet care, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Access to veterinary care is not a problem that's going to go away. If we want to save animals and put them out in communities, we have to find some type of safety net to help owners who are unable to afford the unbelievable cost of vet care nowadays. I have a very good paying job, and there have been times where I'm like, I need the jalopy version of that estimate, doc, because I don't have that kind of money set aside. So until we get to a point where we approach the care for our animals as more of a social welfare type of need versus an independent, if you can't afford it, you don't deserve an animal, we're not going to make many strides. And for me, like talking to your board, if we want to save animals' lives, if we want, and sorry, there's something in the background there. So, you know, and I think the Gray Muzzle organization is a great example. A lot of the dogs, these older dogs that need help, are dogs that 10 years ago would have been euthanized. But now we have this great mindset of we can get animals out, we can get them adopted, we can provide, you know, support to families who are willing to take on animals that maybe need a little bit more care and aren't going to be with the families as much. If we want to save those lives, we have to recognize that there's going to be a need to support those owners and those families. And if you adopt out a dog to a family that can absolutely pay for everything, that's great, but it doesn't help us if all that does is open up a kennel for someone who can't afford to bring another dog in. That's the cycle we have to stop. And we stop that cycle by keeping animals in homes and finding ways to support those families. And I think that we're going to see more and more grants for veterinary care. The Front Street Shelter in Sacramento, my prior organization, has a great one through their nonprofit where they have a $2,500 grant. That is pretty much all you had to do is apply for care credit. If you got approved, you had to use whatever you got for the care first, and then they would give you a $2,500 grant for any type of medical condition that had a good outcome, a good likely prognosis, and you had to spay or neuter your animal. So, you know, a lot of animals, pyometras, fractures, foreign bodies, animals that otherwise would have been surrendered to the shelter, and the shelter would have had to take on all that medical care, got to stay in the home, and the veterinary hospitals that we were contracting with gave the nonprofit a discount. So everything was at discounted, so we were able to do a lot of things within that $2,500. And if you think about the cost of running a shelter over capacity for weeks, months, years, those grants are nothing compared to a strep zoo outbreak, a parvo outbreak, having to move to a model where you have to euthanize for space and time. You know, I hear shelters left and right talking about, we may have to start doing this because we just aren't able to house this many animals in a safe and humane manner. So to me, those are some of the arguments that make financial support for owners more appealing for donors and board members.
Excellent. I'll touch on one more and then I'm sure people have to go. I love that you touched on making job descriptions and applications more inclusive as well, because of any industry. I've never been in a shelter that was fully staffed when I ran it myself, when I worked in it myself. So as everyone leaves here today, we of course think we're not biased at times. And if they had to give like a one-liner, you gave so many good examples that then made us be like, oh, we do that. But like before, how will they say to their staffs or their colleagues something that makes them want to learn more about this, like their elevator pitch or their, you know, one or two sentences? So, because so many people are defensive or,
Mhm.
you know, they don't want to think that way of themselves. So what could they say to their teams and their boards to help them?
I think the biggest thing is that we all got into this field to help animals, but until we can sit down with the humans that those animals depend on and have honest, respectful, understanding conversations about them, their lives, our lives, whatever that may be, we're never going to be able to save as many animals as we could, period. You know, there are barriers that we never experience, so we never think about. An application process to be a volunteer that is only online and that requires online training completely eliminates everybody that doesn't have internet access, period. If it is only in English, it completely eliminates a potential interpreter that you could bring into your facility. If you have a process that requires someone has to be somewhere between these set of hours and people work during those hours, you have created a barrier and you are eliminating a working class group of people. So there are barriers. The more we are willing to break open and recognize where those barriers are for different people and understand that it really has nothing to do with us, but with our processes and our system, the more animals we're going to get out and the more animals we're going to save on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much this was phenomenal. And I think people are going to walk away with some great info to share with their teams. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Awesome.
I appreciate the resources too. So people can.
Yeah, I'll get a PDF of this over to you all so you can have all the links and everything too.
Awesome. All right.
Okay.
We are good to go. And thank you for sparing the extra time as well.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Have a good one.
All right. Have a good one. Bye-bye.